Good afternoon. I'm Matt Jaffe. I'm the Interim Executive Director at the IOP. This afternoon, we are honored to welcome Graham Allison to discuss his new book, Destined for War: Can America and China Escape Thucydides' Trap? We are really grateful to our partners at the Paulson Institute and Harris Public Policy for helping to make this event possible. And I wanted to note that this event today is the first in Paulson's contemporary China series. That is a monthly series, and the next one will be occurring on November the 3rd. Before we begin, I also wanted to plug an upcoming Institute of Politics event. We will be welcoming Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro on Monday. Rosa DeLauro is the representative for Connecticut's 3rd Congressional District. She will be here discussing her new book about the social safety net, and she will be signing copies after the program. That conversation will be moderated by Crystal Coates. Crystal is the Director of Civic Engagement at the IOP. You can sign up for that event. You can also sign up for other IOP events at our website, politics.uchicago.edu. Also, I wanted to mention a few housekeeping notes about today's event. Towards the second half of the conversation, we will open up the floor to take questions from you in the audience. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a mic will be passed around to you. And as always at IOP events, we will give priority to student questions, and the first 3 questions will be asked by students. Now, here to formally introduce our speaker is Ronan Shatsky. Ronan is a second-year student from New York City. He is here studying public policy and economics. Ronan has been deeply involved in the IOP Fellows Program, where he is currently a team leader for our Fellows Ambassadors. Please join me in welcoming Ronan to the podium.
As Americans, it's easy to feel that the danger of war is something we've left far behind. But we should never be lulled into a false sense of security. Advanced as we are, enlightened as we are, there are grim patterns in international politics that repeat themselves throughout history. And right now, tensions with China raise the very real question whether 10, 20 years down the line, our two countries could find ourselves in a serious confrontation. To give us some crucial insight on this question, we are fortunate to have with us here Dr. Graham Allison in a discussion with Dr. Evan A. Feigenbaum. Dr. Allison is the Douglas Dillon Professor of Government at Harvard's Kennedy School, where he served as dean in its formative years. For decades, he has led the way in revolutionizing our approach to foreign policy. He ultimately went on to share his expertise in the Reagan and Clinton administrations. Under Bill Clinton, as Assistant Secretary of Defense, he orchestrated the safe removal of thousands of nuclear weapons from former Soviet countries. This earned him the DoD's highest civilian award, the Distinguished Public Service Medal. Until just this past July, Dr. Allison was also the director of Harvard's acclaimed Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. Dr. Feigenbaum is the vice chairman of the Paulson Institute here at UChicago, a longtime Asia expert. He led much of the Bush administration's Asia policy in the State Department, working closely with Secretaries of State Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice. Recently, Dr. Allison has been thinking a lot about China. He has observed that a proud nation on the rise will often clash with an established power paranoid that its time is up. He calls this phenomenon the Thucydides trap. In his book, Destined for War, Dr. Allison examines this pattern as it has manifested itself over time and applies his analysis to our current relationship with China. So should we be worried? Should we all start learning Chinese characters right away? Let's see what the experts have to say. Please join me in welcoming Drs. Graham Allison and Evan Feigenbaum.
Today, and especially to be doing an event with the Institute of Politics. Since when Axe was talking about creating it, I talked to him a lot since we have an Institute of Politics at the Kennedy School. And in particular, to share the stage with Evan Feigenbaum, a colleague for a couple of decades, from the period in which initially I hired him at the Belfer Center to open our China project, and he began explaining to me who had not been interested in China before that, China, you should probably think about China. It took me a while, because little by little, I'm a slow learner, but over time I came to focus on China. And my old professor at Harvard, Henry Kissinger, kept telling me the same thing, and I was trying to do a book on Lee Kuan Yew, and Lee Kuan Yew kept saying the same thing. Maybe I should remember what Evan told me at the beginning.
But you didn't learn Chinese.
If I were smarter or more agile with language, I would have learned Chinese. And if I were giving you one piece of advice for those of your students, and I applaud your efforts to learn Mandarin, I'd say that's I would like to speak English first, but I would speak Mandarin second. In any case, let me give you, in about 10 minutes, quick, the elevator version of the argument for the book, which I hope you'll become interested in, you'll get a copy, and you'll read. So I'm going to, as the book does, introduce you, or for most of you, I hope, reintroduce you to a great thinker. I'm going to present a big idea, and then I'm going to pose a most consequential question. So the big thinker is Thucydides. Now, having published this book about 3 months or 4 months ago, I've discovered in talking about it in various places, two things about Americans. First, they don't like multisyllabic. Well, that's challenging. And second, Thucydides is a mouthful. So for sure, you're going to at least learn one thing here today, how to pronounce this fellow's name. I'm going to do it in unison. 1, 2, 3. Thucydides. One more time. Thucydides. Okay. So who is Thucydides? He was the father and founder of history. He wrote the first ever history book. It's called The History of the Peloponnesian War. History, as he defined it, being the account of what actually happened, the choices of human beings and their consequences without the benefit of mythology or spirits or other external themes. So the father of history. And you can actually download his book for free, his History of the Peloponnesian War. Read just the first 100 pages, book 1, and if it doesn't knock your socks off, I'll be surprised. So the big idea, Thucydides' trap. This is a term I coined about 6 years ago to make vivid Thucydides' insight about what happens when a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power. And Thucydides' proposition and Thucydides' trap is the dangerous dynamic that occurs when a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power. Thucydides observed this phenomena in classical Greece as Athens rose to challenge Sparta, which had been the dominant power in Greece for 100 years. In the book, I have a chapter on World War I and the rise of Germany, which impacted Britain, which had ruled the world in an empire than which the sun never set for 100 years. And China, as it's been rising over the past generation to challenge the U.S. So just in a word, Thucydides' trap is the dangerous dynamic that occurs. And in general, when a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power, poop happens. Okay? So I look at the last 500 years in the book. I find 16 cases in which a rising power threatened to displace a ruling power. 12 ended in war, 4 in not war. So Thucydides' line about inevitable is hyperbole. That's an exaggeration. But to say the odds are not good would not be. Finally, the consequential question, as I think the introduction already suggested, the subtitle of the book is called Can America and China Escape Thucydides' Trap? And that's a big question. And my answer on that in the book is rather professorial. I apologize, but that's my job. Okay? So the answer is no and yes. Okay? So no, if the U.S. and China insist on business as usual, and that's how I would characterize the last 20 years, in relations between the U.S. and China, both under Democratic and Republican administrations, then I think we should expect history as usual. And history as usual in this case would be a war, even a catastrophic war, despite the fact that nobody wants a war. But yes, we can escape Thucydides' trap if we take to heart Santayana's great line, only those who refuse to study history are condemned to repeat it. So there's no obligation that we make the mistakes that have been made in the previous cases, but if we insist on business as usual, we're likely to. So that's the big picture. Let's see, do we?
About this trap, I find difficult because I even don't know how to pronounce it name.
The Thucydidean traps that people talk about.
The so-called Thucydides trap.
The Thucydides trap.
Thucydides trap.
The Thucydides trap.
Thucydides trap.
The Thucydides trap.
Okay, so this idea has made its way quickly into the policy debate. Xi Jinping picked it up early on and has actually been challenging the Chinese strategic community to think about how to escape Thucydides' trap. But there was a topic of conversation between Obama and Xi at Sunnyland. It's been, in general, part of the conversation. For those of you for whom this still seems, especially undergraduates, a little far-fetched, Thucydides is now even more famous. So the blockbuster of the year is a movie called Wonder Woman. And I'm not going to tell you all about the movie, but in any case, at one point, she's trying to impress Ludendorff, who's the military leader of Germany at the end of World War I, that they should stop the war. She's come to stop the war. And he tells her, peace is only an armistice in an endless war, thinking that he's going to put her down. And she says immediately, Thucydides. And he's flummoxed, okay? So particularly for those of you who want to make sure you're ready in case somebody gives you a quote, answer, Thucydides, okay? Okay. In the longer version of this, I organized the comments under as answers to 3 questions. So I'll state 3 questions, I'll give you my tweet-size answer, and then I'll say just a word about each. Okay? First question, what has been the geopolitical event of the last 25 years, of this past generation? Second question, what will be the geostrategic challenge of the next 25 years, as far as we can see? And the third question is, can the U.S. and China escape Thucydides' trap? Or are we going to find ourselves in a war? In answer to the first question, the geopolitical event of the past quarter century has been the rise of China. Never before has a country risen so far, so fast, on so many different dimensions. Most of us haven't been watching, but I quote Václav Havel, the former Czech president, with a great line in which he says, things have happened so fast, we haven't yet had time to be astonished. So I would say, look at the facts and you will be astonished. Second, what will be the geostrategic challenge next 25 years? The impact of the rise of China, on the U.S., on Americans' sense of their role in the world, and on the international order that the U.S. built in the wake of World War II and has underwritten for 7 decades since then. 7 decades which, as the introduction reminded us, have been without great power war, which is itself a historical anomaly. So the geostrategic challenge going forward, the impact of the rise of China on the U.S. and the international order. And finally, on the question of whether the U.S. and China can escape Thucydides' trap or will find themselves dragged to war, we need to remember that Thucydides' insight about rising power versus ruling power is not, let me say again, not that the rising power thinks I'm big and strong enough, it's time for me to fight Evan. And it's not that Evan looks at me and says, this upstart is getting so strong that pretty soon he's going to challenge me, I should fight him now. Instead, what happens is during this dynamic, a third-party action that's unintended by either of the primary competitors that would otherwise be inconsequential or easily managed leads one of them to react and then the other, and one thing leads to the other in a cascade, at the end of which they find themselves in war. And if we go to the Athens and Sparta story, it's Corinth and Corcyra. If we look at World War I, how in the world could the assassination of an archduke have produced a conflagration that was so devastating that it required historians to create a whole new category? That's why it's called World War I. And in the current case, I would say the chief candidate for this role is Kim Jong-un, who we're going to see in the months immediately ahead either acquire the ability to strike San Francisco with the nuclear weapon, or we're going to strike him to prevent that from happening. So that's the tweet-sized version, just a little more, and then I'll stop here. Well, here's Xi and Obama talking about Thucydides' trap. Rise of China. And I have for those of you who haven't been following, I have I think the best 20-page summary of what's happened over the last 25 years in the China case. And one of the illustrations I offer is this bridge at Harvard, which Evan will remember. It goes across the Charles River between the business school and the Kennedy School. I can see it looking out my office. The discussion of the renovation of it began when I was dean of the Kennedy School. I quit being dean in 1989. The project began in earnest in 2012. It was a 2-year project. So the traffic has been horrible. In 2014, they said it's not finished, it'll take another year. 2015, they said it's not finished, it'll take another year. 2016, they said, we're not going to tell you when it's going to be finished. Okay? There's a bridge just like this in China, in Beijing, called the Sanyan Bridge, which is actually, it's 2.5 times bigger than this in terms of traffic flow. The Chinese decided in 2015 to renovate it. How long did it take to complete? How about a guess?
6 months.
43 hours. 43 hours. This is a YouTube, you could go watch it. Actual picture that's just speeded up and you can see the timeline. 43 hours. If you look at high-speed rail, the U.S. has been building its single piece of high-speed rail from San Francisco to Los Angeles for how long? 10 years. When is it going to be finished? Currently, they say 2029, but many people believe never. Okay. In the past 10 years, how much high-speed rail has China built that's running today? 16,000 miles. 16,000. Okay. In the book, I give you a little checklist that I do of when could China become number one. 26 indicators. Look at it. You'll enjoy it. Okay. Second question. Impact of the rise of China on the U.S. This is a cartoon that I made for testimony to the Senate Armed Services Committee back in 2014, when a former student who's a member of the committee asked me if I would testify about the big picture. So one way to think about what's happened with the rise of China is to imagine a seesaw in a kid's schoolyard with the U.S. sitting on one end of the seesaw and China sitting on the other end. So in 2004, China's about 20% the size of the U.S. In 2014, it's slightly larger, equal or slightly larger. On the current trend lines in 2024, it's going to be 40% bigger than we are. Say, whoa, wait a minute. Nobody told me. Okay? China's economy today is bigger than the U.S. economy, measured by the single best yardstick for comparing national economies in the judgment of the IMF and the CIA, namely purchasing power parity. That was the big takeaway from the 2014 IMF World Bank meeting. It has not sunk in on Americans. You will not read this in the Chicago paper or the New York paper or the Boston paper or the Wall Street Journal. So the impact of the rise of China everywhere, if you haven't seen China in your face and in your space, crowding you, You either haven't been looking or you should just wait a minute.
The committee meets today to consider the nomination of General James Mattis to be the Secretary of Defense of the United States. I thank both Senator Knight and Senator Cohen for being here. He's probably the only one here at this table who can hear the words Thucydides trap and not have to go to Wikipedia. Of course, Secretary Cohen has insulted every member of this committee by suggesting that we don't readily understand that. We're going to have to manage that competition between us and China. There's another piece of wisdom from antiquity that says fear, honor, and interest always seem to be the root causes of why a nation chooses to go to hostilities.
So Mattis, who's also a big reader of Thucydides, that's another line from Thucydides. It's another one that I give you as an epigraph to one of the chapters. So I'm focusing on one big idea in Thucydides. There are a lot of big ideas there. Actually, I have an epigraph from Thucydides at the beginning of each one of the chapters, just to try to whet your appetite. So finally, to North Korea, just for 1 second, and we'll stop here. So at the Mar-a-Lago summit between Trump and Xi in April, Trump said to him, North Korea is the test of our relationship. You can solve this problem, but if you don't solve this problem, I will solve this problem, and you won't like the way I do it. And then he served him chocolate cake at the opening dinner, excused himself, went to the room next door, and announced that the U.S. was launching 59 cruise missiles against Syria to punish Assad for the use of chemical weapons, and just to underline the message. So there's no question whatever that Trump can order a cruise missile attack on North Korean ICBM launch pads to prevent them completing the ICBM tests, which if they complete, will give them capability to strike Los Angeles or San Francisco with nuclear weapons. So that's a fact. The question is, what comes next? And when that question has been addressed on multiple previous occasions in the US government, when Evan was in the government, when I was in the Clinton administration, we looked at this very carefully. The estimate of the overwhelming estimate of the intelligence community is that North Korea will respond by attacking Seoul, the capital of South Korea, where there's about 20 million people, including 200,000 Americans who live, and they can kill hundreds of thousands of people overnight with artillery shells. And then we respond by suppressing those attacks. Otherwise, they'll kill more. And then, well, if we go over after all the targets that can attack South Korea, that's a couple of thousand aim points. So then, that's the Second Korean War. And how did the First Korean War work out? I would say go read about it, okay? In that case, North Korea dragged China and the US into a war with each other that neither wanted. 50,000 Americans died, most of them killed by Chinese. And 1 million Chinese died, most of them killed by Americans. And several million Koreans. So could Kim Jong-un drag US and China into a war? Well, excuse me, the Kim regime already did once. So could this happen again? And I would say, I hope not, I pray not, but it could. So maybe that's enough to get us started.
Great. Well, thanks, Graham, and welcome to Chicago.
Thank you.
Two things at the top. First, I want to thank the Institute of Politics. We always enjoy working jointly, the Paulson Institute and our next door neighbors, actually, over on Woodlawn Avenue. So terrific to do a program with you again. Second, a real pleasure to do this with Graham, who, as he said, if I may return the compliment, we've known each other a long time. In fact, you knew me when? I think we first met in the mid-1990s when I was a newly minted PhD doing a postdoc at Harvard. The world was a lot different then. So we've traveled a long way, but so has the world, as Graham implied in his talk.
At least I had the good fortune to recognize talent.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. So we're going to have a little bit of a conversation up here, and then after a bit, I'll open it up, and we want to get you involved too. I was thinking maybe we could start, there's a lot of different ways we could go on this, but maybe let's start by talking about China a little bit. So, like you, my background is mainly geopolitics, national security, and you're making essentially a geopolitical argument about a geopolitical trap.
Right.
And so, given my background, when I hear about a geopolitical trap, I get all excited and bothered by that. But these days, I run an institute here on campus that's mainly focused on economics and political economy, where we look at China through the prism not of a geopolitical trap, but of actually a very different trap, the so-called middle income trap.
Right.
And the World Bank did a study a few years ago that showed that in 1960, about 101 countries had achieved middle income status. But by 2008, only 13 of them had managed to transcend middle income status and become high income countries. And one of those 13 was Greece, which is not looking so good these days. All right, so the bottom line is, if you look at the story of economics and not just geopolitics over the last half century or so, it's clear that for a lot of countries, including but not limited to China, escaping the middle income trap can introduce all kinds of contradictions into your development process. It's a drag on growth, it's a drag on income inequality, it's a drag on your development. And for economists looking at China, this is a big obsession these days. And so that being the case, it really begins to get to the question of what happens if China can't get through that, and what kind of China we're dealing with, and the relationship between what's happening domestically in China and some of these geopolitical effects. Now, I hear two arguments a lot these days, which are flatly contradictory of each other, right? One is that China has all these internal problems, it's beset by contradictions and development challenges, and therefore it will be necessarily focused internally on solving these many problems. It can't deal with all these external challenges. And so the argument is not quite, don't worry about China, but let's face it, in the great scheme of its priorities, whether it's Xi Jinping or the next leader, China's going to have to focus internally on its problems, and that will mitigate and have a tempering effect on Chinese behavior externally. Then you got people, especially in Washington, who advance precisely the opposite argument. It's kind of a version of the diversionary war argument, that amid all these internal contradictions and challenges, China's leaders will want to distract the public with bright, shiny objects of nationalism and foreign policy adventures. Now, you can run that argument either way, but either way, it gets at this question of what kind of China we're dealing with. And China, as you know, sometimes we hear the story it's going to collapse by next Tuesday. Other times we hear it's going to be the great juggernaut, the next power, it's going to supplant the United States. The story is more complex. But I'm wondering, could you talk a little bit about what kind of China we're dealing with, and whether and how internal contradictions can shape or not the kind of external behavior that we're likely to see from China? And
Okay, thank you. That's a spectacular question, and actually,
the two traps.
You're better positioned to think deeply about this than I am. So let me do one more shout out for Evan and the Paulson Institute. So you all have a fantastic resource here. I don't quite know how the Institute of Politics and the University of Chicago and the Paulson Institute interact, but there's no better place in the country to focus on the questions of the realities about the economics and finance of China than the work that Evan and Hank Paulson and group are doing. So I read it with great interest, and I think the special benefit of it relative to most of the other academic competitors is it's by people who actually have been in the middle of government, who've talked to people who've engaged with their Chinese counterparts, and therefore have an informed judgment of a different sort than just doing an abstract macro analysis. I am familiar with the middle income trap, and I am familiar with the World Bank study. I have this argument with my colleague Larry Summers, who he and I co-chair a China working group at the Belfer Center. And Larry has been bearish about China for a decade. Every year we make a bet, and I've been bullish about China for a decade. I've won all the bets so far. Okay? So I think it comes down to a question about the competence of the government. I mean, if I were taking it as to just be brief about it. And the competence that's been displayed by the Chinese government in coping with the challenges they face has been, to me, quite impressive. And I have the benefit of having some insight about this from a fellow who's Xi Jinping's chief economic advisor, whom you know, Liu He, who was a student of mine 20 years ago at the Kennedy School. And he can describe, as I say in the book, he says, you know, we have 17 insurmountable problems. That was at least the last time I had seen him when I'm writing in the book. And he describes each one of them in greater depth than any analysis I've seen by Westerners of it. And then he says, he smiles and says, you know, and we're going to overcome them. So they get up in the morning thinking they have insurmountable problems, and that's what they're trying to work on. Now, you and I know that we look at this history of these things and think, wait a minute. And especially in the case of China, I mean, that's Singapore, well, at least, you know, they're trying to deal with 6 million people. And they manage this extremely well. And Xi Jinping imagines he can be like Lee Kuan Yew. So that's his hope and aspiration. But how about with 1.4 billion people, with all the complexity? I think, you know, uncertain. But if I were betting it, it was improbable that they could have sustained the rate of growth they have for 10 years, and that it was improbable for the second 10 years, and it was improbable for the next 10 years. We know for sure, it's the Herbstein law, a trend that cannot continue forever won't, okay? But I did the Allison footnote to that, which is that it's much easier to predict that something will happen than when. Okay? So we go to the doctor and he says, Graham, you're going to die. I say, I got that already. Now, when? Okay, that's what's interesting. So who knows? I wouldn't bet against it, though. That's the second thing I'd say is, which I say in the conclusion of the book. Evan will remember, in the course that I teach at the Kennedy School, I have a kind of a crazy idea about what I call the Martian strategist. So it's a way of trying to get outside of our own skin, looking down on what's going on here on planet Earth. And in my picture, this is a lady, a strategist in Mars. And so I imagine that let's just imagine she parachuted into Mar-a-Lago with Trump and Xi. I think she would say to them, you each have a almost insurmountable problem that if you fail to address successfully, the rest is not going to matter very much. That's a prerequisite to whatever else you want to do, and it's right inside your own border. And the question for each of you is, are you able to govern yourself? And she would say, looking at the record the last 10 or 20 years, I doubt it. One of you's got a dysfunctional democracy that's going to be consumed by its own. And the other one is trying to retrofit an authoritarian system that's an operating system that, as Lee Kuan Yew told Xi Jinping, you know, you can't sustain in a world in which people have smartphones. It just doesn't work. So I would say it's a big, big governance challenge in both places. Huge for China, but I would say huge for us too.
But from a strategic planning perspective, you'd say we, the United States, have got to presume that even if we don't know the timeline, and even if we presume there are bumps in the road, that between point A and point P, we're going to face the kind of challenge that you argue.
I would say that the baseline projection that I would propose we plan against is a China that continues growing about 3 times the rate we do.
Right.
And you can then run that out, and it doesn't matter whether it's 10 years or 15 or 20, and that they're eager, not only a China that will be bigger and stronger financially, but that aspires, as Xi Jinping is quite clear, to become predominant in its neighborhood. Right. On the other hand, and I think your point is just right about this, and geopolitical arguments go back and forth, suppose the Chinese economy begin to not perform. So now you're the advisor to Xi Jinping, and your legitimacy is built on his new combination, which is we deliver the goods, economic growth, but also a very significant revival of nationalism, built on national pride that we're finally standing up and reestablishing our established place. Okay? So if you were not able to stand on the first leg, the temptation to stand on the second leg would get larger. So there's dangers in that option, I think, as well.
Right. So what are some of the mitigating factors? You know, I was looking at the book. I think I don't remember all of the cases exactly, but I think most of the non-war cases are clustered toward the 20th century.
The two biggies that are most interesting
Or U.S. Soviet Union.
Are the U.S. Soviet Union and the Cold War, and the rise of U.S. displacing Britain at the beginning of the 20th century. So that's pre-nuclear.
Right, it's pre-nuclear.
Yeah.
Right, but they tend to cluster at the more modern end of the spectrum, which gets at the question of whether something's happening
Right.
in terms of the evolution of international history. So China, you know, one factor could be nuclear weapons. China's had nuclear weapons since 1964, vastly predating the economic rise of the country. The demise of an emphasis on colonial empires, ideologies of empire, the scramble for overseas possessions. How should we think about some of the structural factors that might be changing internationally that would mitigate some of these intrinsic competitive dynamics? And how much do nuclear weapons matter? The fact that the U.S. and China haven't targeted each other.
Fortunately for all of his economics, Evan hasn't gotten away from his origins.
Yeah,
so
love the nukes.
I appreciate and applaud that. So when I try to do an analysis of this sort, and I talk a little bit about this to the conclusion, I say start with the structural realities. So identify as best you can the objective structural realities and the trend lines. So there's three big mitigating factors as I see it. First is nuclear weapons. China and the U.S. now have reached levels of arsenals that establish mutual assured destruction. What that means is that if we do our best to disarm them, they can still destroy us. So therefore, anybody who goes into either leader and says, I have a good idea, why don't we have a nuclear war with the other, knows that they'll be dismissed to the asylum as being insane. That's committing suicide for your nation. So that's a big, big, big bedrock. That doesn't mean risks can't be taken. That doesn't mean the Cuban Missile Crisis didn't happen, where there was a 1 in 3 chance of a nuclear war. So it's not a 100% guarantee, but it's a big, big cautioning factor. Secondly, the U.S. and China have got their economies so entangled and intertwined that if there were a war, Walmart should be empty. And Chinese factories would be producing stuff for nobody. And we couldn't get a loan to cover our deficit. So I think you look at that situation and say, wait a minute, that's a high degree of economic interpenetration and interdependence. We should also remember, just on the other side, that prior to World War I, Britain and Germany were very thickly woven together. So thickly that somebody wrote the bestseller in Europe for the decade before World War I was Norman Angel's famous book, The Great Illusion, which said there can't be war anymore because the winner will lose more than the loser. So war is not profitable, so people won't fight wars. That didn't turn out to be right. Thirdly, there's climate. And while that's not a unanimous view in the U.S., I'm aware, I think everybody who's looked at the evidence sees that if we just keep emitting greenhouse gases the way we've been doing, we're going to have an uninhabitable environment in 100 years or sooner. And if China were to do the same. So neither of us can solve this problem. So you have three big areas of serious, joint, shared, vital interest. So that ought to provide a framework within which then to cope with the minor other elements like North Korea. So I would say that would be the elements from which you would hope, as structurally, you could construct a way of them coping with the asides. I think now the asides are first that China very understandably, as a rising power that gets bigger and stronger, finds it anomalous that the U.S. is the dominant power in Western Asia. So great powers historically are uncomfortable with foreign powers on their borders in the adjacent seas. When the U.S., I have a great chapter in the book on if Xi's China were just like us, which Americans have found somewhat uncomfortable. So this reads the rise of the U.S. through the eyes of Teddy Roosevelt in the period after 1897, when he went to Washington to become the #2 person in the Navy. And it's a pretty amazing story. In the decade that followed, the U.S. seized on a mysterious explosion in Havana Harbor to declare war on Spain and liberate Cuba, take Puerto Rico. That's how Puerto Rico became part of the U.S. And Guam. That's how Guam. To sponsor and support a coup in Colombia to create a whole new country. Panama, which the next day gave us our contract for a canal so Teddy's ships could move between the Atlantic and Pacific. Threatened war, first with Germany, then with Britain, unless they butted out of a territorial dispute in Venezuela. And then actually stole the largest part of the fat tail of Alaska, the strip of land that cuts off Canada from the sea for about 600 miles running from Alaska down to, to Juneau. And then announced the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which said, if any country behaves in ways we don't like, we send the Marines and change the government. And every year that followed for the next decade, we send the Marines somewhere and change the government. So she is kind of mild as compared to that so far. So a rising power looks out and says, that's strange, you guys are there. In fact, in the book, as you know, Evan, I say what a Chinese PLA Navy guy told me. He said, China sees, China sees. He says, what's the name of this body of water next to us here? It's called South China Sea. This other one, what that's called on your own map, it's called East China Sea. So why the U.S. Navy is the arbiter of events in the South China Sea, tells who can build an island or who owns an island. Why should you have an opinion about this? And it's very, very reminiscent of Teddy Roosevelt saying, what the hell are the Spanish doing in Cuba?
Of course, the Filipinos call it the West Philippine Sea.
Yes. Okay. Well, there are a few other people that have a different name, but on our official U.S. Navy map, Feigenbaum map, it says South China Sea, East China Sea. And the Chinese think that may be their sea. So I think that's an area inevitably in which you're going to see people bumping up against each other. And the other is, I say, these third-party actions like North Korea, where I was in Beijing about 7 weeks ago because the people in China are extremely interested in the Thucydidean trap issue. And talking to somebody about, like I said, look, my theory is that if we just had adults to sit down and talk privately, we could find a way to deal with the North Korean problem. And so I said, for example,
The U.S. and China, not the U.S. and China.
I said, so let's just say, if we were talking completely privately, this is a person who talks to Xi sometimes, okay? So he said, okay, well, I'll tell you the truth. There'd be no problem on the Korean Peninsula if you weren't there. I said, well, okay, I ask you, how could we solve this problem? But I hadn't thought about that. How do you make that? He says, if you weren't there, there would be a unified Korea. It would be a tributary of China. We would never allow it to have nuclear weapons. No more than we would let Vietnam have nuclear weapons or Myanmar. I mean, we just tell them, forget about it. So I said, well, let me tell you my narrative. We didn't volunteer to be in Korea. We came there to rescue South Korea after North Korea. Your ally attacked them. And then we beat them back up the peninsula. Maybe we overdid it by getting close to your border. You came into the war. We ended with an armistice. But since that armistice 60 years ago, South Korea is one of the most successful countries in the world. It's a democracy, a vibrant country, 13th largest economy. So we're proud of South Korea as a kind of almost a poster child of the Asian order that the Americans created. And we're not going anywhere.
Right.
He said, well, there's the problem.
Right. So I've heard that Chinese narrative too. So here's what's missing from that Chinese narrative, among other things: Koreans, right? Which gets at another aspect of this issue of constraint. When I look at China's neighborhood, you've got India on one border, which is also a large continental-sized country.
Right.
That's going to be a top 5 global economy sometime in the next 15, 20 years, with its own nuclear weapons, moving toward a next-generation nuclear deterrent and the delivery systems associated with that. You've got Japan, a latent nuclear power,
Right.
the world's 3rd largest economy, big industrial power, high-tech power. You got South Korea,
Right.
and you got North Korea,
Right.
both of which share a commitment to 500 years of Korean nationalism, each in their way.
In their own way.
In their own way. And the North Koreans, in fact, manipulate Korean nationalism and their narrative of fighting Japan for their own ends. You got Vietnam, you've got other, and so you have this network of middle powers, latent great powers, in Japan's case, an actual economic great power,
Right.
and a latent military great power, latent nuclear capabilities. So quite apart from the U.S. China story, you have this Asian drama that includes all of these other players. Why is that not a constraint on China's aspirations in the first instance, but on U.S. China competition in the second?
Well, it's fantastic. And so I would just say yes. All those are additional structural realities for China. I think that for a while, I mean, you and I can remember conversations with Chinese 20 years ago in which they would say, never do we have any aspirations to do anything other than just, become a little less poor. So we're just a developing country minding our own business, and hide and bide became a kind of an umbrella for this. Then they said, well, how about peaceful rise? So all we're doing is just trying to become a little more wealthy. And in those conversations, people would often say, we actually think, because we would say, you should be appreciative. I've given this speech before. I have to smile now that I think about it in retrospect. But, you should be appreciative of what we are doing for you, China, because otherwise, South Korea would probably have nuclear weapons. I mean, they were trying to get nuclear weapons at one stage, and the U.S. said, choose between having nuclear weapons and having American troops. And if South Korea became a nuclear weapon state, Japan would become a nuclear weapon state. And so now you've got China and India and South Korea and Japan. You're going to have a nuclear contest in the region. And that could become very unstable for you. So we're doing you a favor, for that. I would say for a while, some Chinese strategists said, yeah. I think now they say, no. That was then, now is now. We can cope with this problem now. We understand that we're not going to be like you in your hemisphere, where you didn't have any competitors. So we do have a serious competitor in Japan, and there's no love lost there. We know that we've always had a long time, problems with South Korea, with Vietnam especially, with Korea, all of Korea, and with Vietnam. I think India, they continue to believe will not really make it. It'll always be the land of the future. So I think for us, my colleague Ash Carter, who's I've recruited to be my successor at the Belfer Center now. So Ash likes to say, the Asians love us. When we go to Asia, they all say, oh, we're so happy to see you. We need you to be here. And I said, Ash, why not? They think we're defending them. Okay? Why shouldn't they be happy to have somebody defend them against somebody who's big and dangerous? The question is ties of alliance run in both directions. And actually how Corinth and Athens got dragged into a war was their ally, how Sparta and Athens got dragged into the war, is their ally dragged them in. World War I is allies dragging people along. So I think this may actually be more dangerous for us as we try to figure out, how to fashion an environment for China.
Okay, let's get you guys involved. I want to take a bunch from students first, and to give you a lot of different ideas to play with. Let's take 3 at once. So we have 3 students out there. Okay, 1 in back, 1 here, and then 1 here. So go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. Thank you, both of you, for the wonderful talks. I'm a student at the Harris Public Policy School.
Great.
My question is about, I noticed there's a new company called Jigsaw, which is actually underneath the Google umbrella, and the CEO and founder of it came from the State Department, and what it does is it it tracks cyber attacks from other countries around the world. It combats oppression of freedom of speech and so forth. So the way I see it, it's sort of opening the door to privatization of U.S. policy planning in terms of global geopolitics. So do you see that? Do you think that will expand? And if so, how might that play out? Mainly, do you think that will expand?
Okay, before you answer, let's get two more on the table. There was one back here. Yeah, please.
So the conversation of the possible confrontation of China with the United States seems to be framed in hard material terms, economic, military, possible confrontations. But I'd like to get your thoughts on the role of soft power and culture and ideas and popular culture in this conversation. There was an article in Foreign Policy earlier this year called "Why is China So Uncool?" And it gets to the effect that as China is trying to seemingly manufacture its soft power capabilities abroad, there still are those deep-seated contradictions that you mentioned earlier. Like the Confucius Institute's coverage seems to be that they haven't been very effective. And then the recent Cambridge University Press controversy, that kind of speaks to those deep-seated contradictions. So I'd like to get your thought on that.
Okay, and one more here. Why don't we get your mic?
Hi, my name is Coco. I'm also a first-year student at Harris School of Public Policy. My question will be, so we were talking about joint shared vital interests that China and the U.S. have. I'm just wondering how big of the economic interdependence is gonna make the war more costly for both countries. Also because there's this term that I've heard recently. It's called like hot economics and cold politics. I'm just wondering like how true this statement is.
Say it again.
It's hot economics and cold politics.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right.
Okay.
Take your
Great
pick.
questions. I'm trying to be, I won't do justice to the questions, but I'll try to at least respond briefly. First, on privatization of the private sector, Google, Jigsaw et al., and as well as in the Chinese case, let's take Tencent or Alibaba and the governments. The relationships between those are thicker than you would understand from reading in the newspapers, and inevitably so. And there will be many companies that are trying to track cyber attacks because cyber attacks have big impact on companies. And the government is not able to defend them successfully. And so if you're any one of the companies that have been hacked lately, you're interested in trying to, or anyone like them, you're interested in all the protection that you can get. So I would say this whole space is moving rapidly. I think in particular in the Chinese case, the entities that are involved in both offensive and defensive cyber activity have always lived in a big gray zone. But there's actually a little more gray in the American picture than usually meets the eye. On the soft power and ideas, which may relate to the hard economics and soft power, I think, as one of my Chinese friends says, I would be happy to have a contest between hard power and soft power any day. So tell me how your soft power prevented Russia taking over Ukraine or achieved your objectives in Syria or so another version of this would say, look, if we can be feared, and then if we can be respected, we don't have to be loved. The current version of this, Eric Lee, I think, is one of the interesting people to read on the subject. He basically says, if we show that we're competent to perform, so we can fix a bridge and you spend however long fixing a bridge, and we can show we can grow an economy a lot faster than you can, and we have a government that's not all the time tangled up the way your government is. I mean, we don't have Donald Trump as, the head of China. We don't have a government or, a Congress or Parliament that can't pass laws, don't have even a budget. He said, people will look and say, if they've got a system for driving the bus, that looks like a pretty good system for me. Good enough. So if we're going to want to people doing emulation. Now, I don't agree with this. Okay, I'm a old-fashioned, small L, Western liberal, but that's a set of beliefs I have. But I think the evidence at this stage would be at least an argument. And that's the same thing on the hard power, hard economics, soft power. If you look at the game over the last 20 years in the South China Sea and ASEAN, and you ask, I have a little bit of description of this in the end of the first chapter from a Rip Van Winkle moment that a great American diplomat, who's a friend of both Evans and mine, who's now deceased, is Steve Bosworth. Right? So 20 years ago, there would be no question whatever if anything happened in the region. The first capital folks in Indonesia or Malaysia or the Philippines or Vietnam or even Singapore would think it's the U.S., Washington. First place they would call. He said when he arrived in Asia after about an 8-year hiatus, he's an Asian hand, in 2009, when he became Obama's special emissary for North Korea, he went and visited all the regions, and he came back and he said he had been shocked that now the first place they look every day is in Beijing. The first question they ask is for Beijing. So they may not love China, but if it's its number one market, their number one importer, their number one investor, and they've shown a demonstrated willingness to squeeze people when they behave ways they don't like, they can get their way, maybe grudgingly, but get their way.
All right, let's take a couple more. Let's see, we can take one here, and yeah, I'm just looking for more students, and one back there. All right.
Hi, I'm a first year in college, and I kind of just want to ask, you talked earlier about complex interdependence theory, what was proposed by Joseph Nye. Do you think that will come into play when China reaches an extent where its economic and perhaps military capacity meets that of the U.S., will it try to challenge the smaller kind of focal points in which a war could begin, like the fact that the U.S. holds a lot of the choke points for trade into China, and places where, in smaller areas where China, where people might not think a war would begin, but where aggression can start and be ignited.
Okay, and then there's one more back there.
I'm from Harris Public Policy, and my question about the Thucydides trap is, I'm from a higher education policy background, so it's new to me, but I'm very curious. So from my understanding, the prerequisite for this trap to stand is, number one, all the nations, it's natural for them to survive and to expand. Number two, they're competing for the same types of resources to achieve this goal. Number three, these resources are not reproducible or renewable. And number four, the internal conflict will not impede or constrain or deter the expansion of this country. So based on these four, I don't know if they're right because I'm really new to this area, but my question is, so when you review these four assumptions for this trap to stand, so is China the country of the expansive nature and the capacity? Number two, what are the resources that China and the U.S. are competing for if they, when they grow? Number three, are these resources really not reproducible or renewable? The fourth one you already touched upon is how big will be the constraint that the internal conflicts of these two countries have on their expansion capacities? It's a very long question. You don't need to be really go through them, but it's just my curiosity. Thank you.
So let me do the two quickly. I'll start with the second one and go back. So it's a very good question. In the book, I look at 16 cases, not including Thucydides' case. So 16 cases in the last 500 years. it turns out there's no silver bullet or single variable. Your attempt to try to have 4 items are worth doing, and you could run those across all 16 cases and see whether in some instances there's more of this, there's more of that. Every case has its own nuances. Every case is different. But in every instance, I think you'll find a case in which you'll get a check by all those boxes and you get to war. And you also get a check by all those boxes and you don't get to war. So, it's more complicated than that. And I think in particular, while it's worth starting with the structural realities that the U.S. simply in its own narrow, selfish, vital national interest requires not having a war with China. And China, in its own national, selfish interests, has not having a war with the U.S. So this would be a catastrophic outcome for both. So then you would say, well, then war can't happen. And that would only be because you hadn't looked at history. So in the case of World War I, what happened to the aspirations of every one of the principal actors? So the Austro-Hungarian emperor was trying to hold together his empire. It was dissolved, and he was gone. Russian Tsar was trying to support the Serbs. He'd been overthrown, his whole regime, by the Bolsheviks, and he's gone. The Kaiser in Germany is backing his buddy in Vienna. He's gone, out. French are militarily allied with Russia. They are bled of their youth for a whole generation. Society never recovers. And Britain, which has been a creditor for 100 years, is turned into a debtor and is on a slow slide to decline. So at the end of the war, if you'd given people a chance for a do-over, no one of the leaders would have chosen what he did. But they did, and this happened. So I would say it's worth looking at the areas for the reasons why this would be crazy. It's worth reminding ourselves that this would be crazy. I mean, the purpose of this book is not about fatalism, and it's not about pessimism. It's not to, I say at one stage, it's not to predict the future, but to prevent it. So this is a book about how to prevent falling into Thucydides' trap. But I think Xi Jinping's line about the challenge is only how to escape Thucydides' trap. And I think that requires thinking about the danger and then thinking about ways in which countries like North Korea could drag us somewhere where we don't want to go. On the first question, complex interdependence, that's a complicated question and a good question. So complex interdependence is an important idea, but there's a temptation to think of interdependence as if it was symmetrical. And Joe often portrays it as symmetrical. I'm very much more interested in asymmetrical interdependence. So if I think about the interdependence between the drug dealer and the addict, I mean, if I don't have an addict, I don't have anybody to sell my drugs to. But if you don't buy your drugs, you have a bigger problem than that. Okay? So if I watch, the theory of the case has been for some time, and I think it's still not settled, but I would say it's pretty close to settled, that as China became more entangled in the international system, the rule-based international system that the US had built, it would become more like us and would then become a more responsible stakeholder, as our colleague Bob Zellick put it. Well, that's one possibility. But the other possibility is that I become more entangled in your system. I demand more say and sway about my influence in the system relative to yours. And a very good case to study in this instance is concessional loans to developing countries and the World Bank. So in the World Bank, which was created by the US after World War II, and which has played a very important role, it was for a long time the principal source of loans for developing countries. China wanted a bigger say in the World Bank. US has resisted China having a bigger say. China created most recently this Asian Infrastructure Development Bank. Today, Chinese concessional loans to developing countries is 4 times larger, just Chinese loans, than the World Bank. And if you look at the IMF, this is another amazing and interesting story, which still hasn't been told, but where, as the U.S. attempts to continue to hold our position, which we wrote into the circumstances when we created the IMF, is basically having a unilateral veto, China is finding that uncomfortable and is moving to see what other arrangements are possible. So I would say that complex interdependence can either be that as I become more interdependent, I become more, quote, responsible, as you would think of it, or alternatively, I have more leverage.
Well, on that cheery note, what's that what is that famous line from Bettman Hovig had that line about after World War I, they said, what were the causes of war? And
He's got a famous line. So this is, which I use several times in the book. So this is the end of World War I. This crazy thing has happened in Europe, which has been the centerpiece of civilization for 1,000 years, has come crashing down. So they asked one of the principal leaders, they've been the prime minister is in effect in Germany, how did this happen? And he says, if we only knew.
So there you go. Well, Graham, we're so delighted you came to Chicago. There are a lot more questions, so if you have a couple of minutes, maybe you could stick around and talk to a couple of people.
And I think they have some books outside if you're interested. If you read the book and you like it, or don't like it, both, I think. I'm interested in reactions to it. So I would say send me an email and I'll be interested to see.
All right, great. Well, please join me in thanking Jim.